right. We up there? Yep. Welcome back to some of you. Hello to anyone who may be new. Lost the thing. We're going to cover Rethinking Analytics. We want to say off the bat, we appreciate those of you who came to this talk that maybe is not as fun sounding as others. When the CWR folks asked us to present an analytics talk, we said, okay, let's try to make this as good for everybody as possible. All right, as we mentioned before, we're Jessica and Christina. We didn't mean to wear the same outfit, but we did.
Is this picture?
As our picture.
We have other clothes.
We do. Hey, you, as you know, are communicators and collaborators with women religious and congregations. And we all want to know and make sure that we're maximizing the resources of these congregations we work with, so we know what to spend our resources on. So this includes time, money, and staff, which is their time, but also staff energy and mental health and mood. And remember, we're spending these resources for a reason, so that we can be as successful as we can. One of the big ways to know what to do with your resources is data. So knowing what's working, what's not working, and how our output is meeting our goals or not. And that data should be both useful and ethical. To address perhaps the elephant in the room, this is not a Google Analytics talk or a Facebook Pixel talk or anything like that. We are intentionally thinking fresh, taking a step back, looking at this whole topic with new eyes, new ideas. We know that for some, this whole topic of analytics can feel overwhelming and number heavy and unrealistic, and it doesn't have to feel that way. And others may love Google Analytics, but we are trying to shake things up on brand and challenge you all to use your imaginations and reframe this topic to look at it in a new way. As we said in the last talk, we do mention some services and resources in this talk, but they're all on that same page. You can get there from that website. After this talk, we'll go hook the links in. I just realized they don't work yet. But you'll be able to access the full resource list there later.
It is squeaky. Okay, so first we're going to take a look at what can be wrong or challenging with the lots of the current models for doing analytics on your website. So why should we not just keep doing what we've been doing or been told to do for website analytics, which is, to be clear, most likely Google Analytics for most people. So to think this through, we have a fun little analogy for you. So let's talk about what these current model third-party tracking methods like Google Analytics actually are. Okay, so we are going to put ourselves in the shoes of people who are going to attend an art gallery that we have, or an art opening that we've heard is happening in a gallery in town. So we've all heard about it, we've got together, and we're gonna head to the gallery for this event today. Okay, so when you get there and you walk in the door, now imagine that there are some strangers there with clipboards to say hello, and they put on a wristband and they put it on real tight, and then they just start like following you around with their clipboard, and they're just taking notes like, what street did you come in from? Which door did you come in? What are you wearing? How tall are you? They take a guess what gender they think you are. And then, as we're trying to just go around and enjoy this art, if you stand in front of any particular piece of art they're sitting there with a timer, noting exactly how long you stood there. They might be tracking your eyes and see exactly what they're doing. If you go get something to eat, they're going to write down the punch you pick up to drink. They're going to note which crackers and cookies you liked best and exactly how many you ate. And then when you go to the bathroom, they're even going to maybe make some guesses about your health and dietary habits. Of course, if you purchase anything, they're going to have to take down information on if you paid by credit card or cash. Then they're going to really just follow us around. They're going to notice when we leave, which door we use when we leave. And then the kicker of it all is they're going to follow us all home. To learn more about us, they might follow us for 24 hours. They might follow us around for 30 days, or they might even follow us around for 90 days. So they're going to take notes this whole time, where we're dropping our kids off at school, where we go to buy our groceries, In sum, they're getting a lot of information about us. So you can hopefully see where we're going with this. You as an organization would absolutely never run your events this way when people visit you, but you might unintentionally be providing this same sort of experience that's pretty awful to your website visitors. So the first issue, as might be apparent, with this current model is privacy concerns. So just as a super simplification for anybody that's not familiar with how analytics work, traditional analytics do their job by putting little tracking scripts on your website. And then when a person visits, that puts a cookie on the computer of your visitor. And then these scripts and these cookies gather all kinds of information about the user and what they do. And not only are they doing it at your site, but it follows them around to other sites they go to after they come to yours. So fundamentally, these tracking scripts can really be very invasive. Because of all these privacy concerns, there's been lawmakers lately who have all around the world been cracking down on these third-party tracking scripts and cookies. So we did mention this a little bit in the last talk, but there are lots of recent laws that you might have heard of. This includes GDPR, and there's a couple of laws currently passed in California, and there's a whole docket of hundreds of new laws that aren't passed yet, but are coming up to be passed possibly in lots of states and cities. So once these laws come into place, they all do something different, but generally they're all saying that before you can use a third-party script or cookie onto somebody's site or computer, you have to get their consent. So this is why you've seen like a plethora of those cookie banner pop-ups on every single site you go to, and you may have noticed they're all different. Some of them are like, I accept, I reject. Some are like, okay. Some just say, by using this site, you are. So that's why. That's in response to these laws. So this quote here is from Stefan Hamill, and he is a marketing privacy guy. So he went to this big conference of professionals, and they had a big discussion, and nobody could agree, even at this conference of professionals, on this analytics stuff. So he said, at that time, when the brightest in our industry can't figure it out, if Google Analytics is legitimate and legal under such and such conditions, imagine how screwed everybody else is. So that's us. Yay. But laws aside, the privacy of your users actually does matter. So it's a justice issue. People don't want to be tracked. You probably don't want to be tracked on websites. And then when people learn how creepy and invasive these trackers are, they consistently wish to be free of them. And I mean, who doesn't wish that these giant companies that are bigger than whole countries like Google know all this information about us? So as congregations, we can think of it as a matter of right relationship. You would never be this creepy in person. So we need to be sure not to accidentally be creepy on the internet. Okay, then the second issue that we can look at that's quote unquote wrong with the current model is the ecological consequences of all of this tracking. So you might not have ever thought about this, but collecting all of this data really adds electricity and bandwidth usage to every single page on your site. So every single visitor has to load the tracking script code, and then there's all this data mining and processing on the server side that is using a lot of energy too. And it's really easy to forget that data does take up space and energy. So this is a photo, a different photo than the last talk, of rows and rows of servers inside a Google data center. I think this one might be in Iowa. And this is housing capacity for the Google Cloud platform that runs analytics stuff. So, and you can see there's tons of wires and lights. That's a lot of electricity right there. So while we don't always think about it, processing and storing all of that data uses a ton of energy and physical space and materials as well. And the kicker is that all of that ecological impact happens whether you look at all that data you're collecting or not. So there's a green tech guru that we quote a lot. We even shorthand refer. He'd be weirded out if we'll be like, what would Jerry say? But Jerry McGovern says, The most substantial pollution from Google Analytics comes from the processing and analysis of the data.
And a third issue with this current model is that it's hard. As we said before, it's legally confusing because many industry experts don't know or agree on what is even allowed. And in particular, it's worth noting that if you look at the Google help docs, they just say it's up to you to know if this is okay on your site, and then you check some terms and services and you're agreeing that if you mess up, it's on you. So it puts the brunt on all of us to figure this out. But also it's technically challenging to implement analytics like this now, especially when that consent is needed. So what used to just be maybe putting a little number in a box somewhere to install Google Analytics now is much more complicated. And this puts this in the realm of web folks and tech people instead of all of us. It's also conceptually challenging to just sort through all these piles of data and mentally convert it to something actionable and usable. As this slide says, if you've been in Google Analytics, the interface lately, down the left-hand side of the dashboard in the standard Google Analytics setup, there's 125 at least options that you could get to. There are at least 290 different kinds of metrics you can track. I was a Google Analytics certified individual for a little bit in the past, and it was hours of class time and reading just to understand the basic implementations of Google Analytics, let alone anything fancy. And nobody's ever this happy to look at their analytics. Web analytics expert Marco Saric says that analyzing these metrics can be a full-time job that requires a lot of time, effort, expertise, and experience to do well. Many Google Analytics users end up creating custom dashboards where they add a few widgets with useful metrics that they get actual value from, and then they ignore everything else that Google Analytics tracks. Some just ignore Google Analytics completely, as it's overwhelming to even start with. This may sound familiar to some of you. And remember, even if you're not looking at all of that data, Google is still collecting it and mining it all. All those ecological effects of the data processing and churning are still happening. And Google's still getting access to all of this personal information about your site's visitors. And finally, the analytics information that you can get from many of these current implementations is often not actually that helpful to you. We already mentioned it's overwhelming and it's a lot to dig into without expertise and education. But increasingly, it's also just wildly inaccurate. Because when some people opt out of your tracking mechanisms, your data becomes much less complete. And more individual people are using ad blockers and browser extensions that are keeping Google Analytics from even loading on your site in the first place because they don't want you to track them. And additionally, you see a fair amount of bad actors, bots and referral spam that's just mucking up your data on purpose who need better hobbies. For one women religious client, we implemented a cookie banner on their website after GDPR was initially passed. And following the guidelines, site visitors could choose to either accept cookies or opt out of them. And we found that at least 89% of visitors, when given the chance, opted out of allowing the site to track them. So now we had Google Analytics data, but it was maybe only 11% of their traffic. And it was the kind of person who just says okay to a cookie banner, so maybe it's not a representative sample. It's just wildly inaccurate. It's a subset of your visitors and it's not useful. But also with this kind of current Google Analytics sort of model, you can get stuck in the mindset that these numbers are what matter instead of the reasons behind the numbers. So you might hear somebody say, ooh, we got 100 hits. So what? What's the takeaway? What changes? And data points themselves don't tell the full stories. If a visitor visited 8 pages on your site, without context, you don't know if this number is a good thing or a bad thing. Was the site visitor happy? I visited 8 pages because everything was so interesting. I might volunteer or donate. Or were they unhappy? I visited 8 pages because I could not find what I was needing. I'm so crabby. If you just see 8 hits, that number alone, you really don't know that broader context of what was going on. And additionally, in the realm of just numbers not telling the whole truth, it's important to remember that data is never as pure as it may seem because it's reflecting biased humans. And data is a mirror of our existing biases. So we can miss context or misinterpret data because of these biases we hold. Worst case sort of scenario, you can imagine a situation where a toy maker cites the data that buyers currently purchase more white dolls than black dolls, and then use that as a deciding factor to stop selling black dolls, which has happened. And that's obviously not a correct or a cohesive or ethical read of that data, and it doesn't take into the context of a much broader analysis, and that wasn't the action they should have taken. Data bias is a whole field of study. It's more than we can get into more today, but just it can be dangerous and unethical to put too much faith in our interpretations of data that's of what we're looking at. But the conclusion, the too long didn't read of it, is it's probably overkill. Some people in businesses might need that Google Analytics stuff. Huge e-commerce sites tracking user journeys and sites getting millions and millions of views a month. But in our experience, for most people in organizations we work with, like congregations, it really is overkill. And it gets you stuck in this mindset that Google Analytics is the only place you can learn anything. And we forget that there's other, less techy, more organic ways to get useful information that we can act on.
Okay, so more fun to think about. Let's talk about a better way. All is not lost. We have an idea for you of a new mental model, which could be for you a new way of thinking about website analytics overall. So first, we'll take a little brief philosophical interlude about taking the path less traveled. We know that this can feel like you're swimming upstream, but as you're doing that, you will confront things that make it hard. Almost every analytics and marketing resource assumes that you're using Google Analytics. Various tools that you use tell you that you have to install trackers to use them. So this can be like Google Ads that tell you have to put a cookie-based code on your website, or Facebook ads that require that little Facebook pixel. So it's hard, but women religious communities, out of all the types of organizations out there, are quite frankly used to doing really hard countercultural things, so you'll be better for it. Okay, so you can still collect data, don't get us wrong. We just don't want to be really creepy about it. So we're not saying analytics are bad, analytics are great. It's very useful to have information that you can use. And you, of course, want to use that to guide your decisions and your actions in the future. We just don't have to do it this one way that we've all been told is the only way or even the best way. And you can absolutely creatively get a lot of data from things that you already know how to do. So you can do that without being weird about tracking people or wasting a lot of your resources on things that just aren't even serving you well. This is a reminder for us, this visual here, that when we say website analytics, we do not mean the various analytical tools themselves that we've all come to know. So you can't just install Google Analytics and then say, I'm doing analytics. There's actually a whole cycle up here that you have to think about intentionally. So analytics at its heart should always be a whole cycle of intentional work. Asking the right questions, creatively finding answers, and taking any indicated actions based on what you learn. And right there, that little heart right in the middle, it all has to be tied to your organization's goals and your overall website content strategy. So we ask our questions, we collect data to see if we analyze it, if we can get some answers, and then we try things and we see what happens. And that sounds a lot less scary than Google Analytics, doesn't it? So our talk today is presenting new ways to think about and do this full analytical cycle. So first in this cycle of analytics is ask specific questions rather than mindlessly collecting the millions of things that Google just defaultly does for you. So ask your questions specifically with a because in mind. We might ask, what type of content seems to be the most valuable to our readers? Because then we can focus on prioritizing our work around those topics. We might ask, are we doing a good job of sharing our important information? Or are people getting lost on our site? Because maybe we could add or reorganize content to be more helpful or to our visitors if we keep hearing them ask the same questions. Or we could even have a really specific question like, was our Giving Tuesday social media push successful? Because we want to make sure that we're putting our time, money, and staff effort into the right places that are making a difference. To state a really obvious but often forgotten fact, analytics should always be answering questions that are tied to your organization's goals. Numbers themselves are useless unless they're helping you get somewhere. We're really not looking for meaningless, how many hits numbers. Instead, the question itself should be tied to your organization's goals. And of course, to do this, your organization needs to have clearly defined goals. So when you can, like we've said, try to foster this culture of goal setting, when your congregation is talking about the big goals, it also helps you with the smaller goals to get you there too. Okay, that was the first step. So then the next step in our cycle of analytics is that we figure out creative ways to answer those questions we have now asked. Where could we look for answers to those questions? And where can we learn from all the different places that data might be? We're going to give you some ideas of places on where to look in a minute, but in general, this does not have to feel like there's only one way to ever answer those questions, like Google Analytics. There are potentially lots of different ways that you can answer the same questions because there's more than one way up a mountain. Third in our cycle of analytics, we'll kind of come back to that second one in a minute. So after that step, then we're going to try new things based on what we've learned. So this is sort of a science, but it's also an art. You are a student every single time you come back through this cycle. So you try things, you see what happens, ask new questions, keep going. Sometimes the answer you get is, wow, what we're doing is really working. So could we prioritize this or optimize this in some way? Sometimes when you've looked at the data, you might say, yeah, what we tried did not work at all. Let's try something else. And sometimes, the best cases really, the answer completely surprises you and you go off in a new direction that you would have never thought of if you hadn't learned what you did. This here is a great quote from Avinash Kaushik. He's an old school Google Analytics guy, ironically, but now he's really been a champion of coming to your data with reason and questions. He says, ask every web metric that you report the question, so what, 3 times. Each question provides an answer that in turn raises another question, a so what again. If at the third so what, you don't get a recommendation for an action that you should take, you have the wrong metric, kill it. This brutal recommendation is to force you to confront this reality. If you can't take action, some action, any action, based on your analysis, why are you reporting data?
There are a few things to remember just as we go through this 3-part cycle of analytics. So first, remember the power of relative data. Sometimes relative is just as useful or more useful or just differently useful than like hard numbers. Instead, something more useful to report from your own data may be trends and observations relative to your data from your site. So saying these pages got over 100 hits might not give you any actionable insight, but instead look at data points from your website like these are our most visited 20 pages. because then we can act on this list. We now have a good list of pages to pay close attention to in this particular way. So for the pages that are in this list, we can be sure we are tending to them regularly. Wow, if that is one of our most visited pages, we should make sure we check and update that content on a regular schedule. We may want to cross-promote other content from this most visited content. So if you know a certain page is the most visited page, let's make sure it links to other high-value content that we want them to see. Donations, event registrations, etc. And we can check each of these often visited pages to be sure that they're meeting our content strategy goals for the site. So does the site visitor see a clear call to action? Do they know what to do? How can we encourage all the visitors seeing this content to continue their engagement in the relationship with the congregation? Here's just an example of using relative data to help you take actions towards your goals. So we're looking here at a page on the website of the Sisters of Providence, St. Mary of the Woods. And when they looked at their data, they saw that this Sunday brunch page kept showing up in the most visited content. So their communications team paid attention, and they made sure that they acted appropriately based on this relative popularity to optimize the page and set up a maintenance schedule. They made sure to keep the information up to date, so the costs and the times. And for now, there's also that COVID information right at top for visitors to know. And they also made sure to have a clear call to action on the page right there. You can buy brunch tickets. And lastly, they took the opportunity to cross-promote other content. Some of the opportunities were already built into the site. That sectional menu down the side gives some really good other places if someone might want to look. But they also added, specific to this page, that green box at the bottom that says, while you're here, and it mentions their shrine and some more spiritual opportunities. Because they know it's nice to have brunch visitors, but wouldn't it be great if these people also learned more about the congregation or felt compelled to keep continuing that relationship?
Another thing to remember regarding analytics is to be really cautious of comparison with other groups or organizations. So we often talk to each other, and that's great, but in doing so, you might hear specific numbers or info from other congregations or other nonprofits. And while sometimes comparison is absolutely useful, just to get like a general sense of things and to learn from each other, we still want to remember that when you have data from other folks, you don't really know their full context. So it might feel like you're both apples that you're comparing, but they might be more orangey than you realize. And so that direct comparison probably won't be very helpful. You're defining what success looks like individually for you and your congregation, and then you're trying to get there. So don't get distracted or swept up by the journey of another organization. And then finally, remember to stay open-minded for every part of this cycle of analytics. We want to be creative. We want to ask creatively. We want to find that data and answers creatively, and we want to act creatively. We do want to note that if you're always finding the data that you expect to see, you're probably doing something wrong. It could be a bias. It could be a closed garden thinking that's happening. So we encourage you to take a step back and try asking a different question and then see what happens. So aim to be surprised sometimes. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. Erica Hull is a web developer and a researcher, and she writes, "It feels too good to be proven right. Confirmation bias lurks around every corner, so stay strong, aim to be proven wrong, and you'll be far more right in the long run."
Okay, finally, let's get at some places to look for answers. So that, remember, we get the answers and then we act on all this awesome data you're going to get. So if we take a look at our art opening again, let's rethink it, because data is good and it's really smart for the art opener, the art gallery, to like wonder how their event went, look at some data about it. But if we put ourselves in the shoes of the gallery owner, there's some specific questions we have and we'd like to gather answers. So to answer how many people came, instead of creepy guys with clipboards, maybe we put people at the door with like those handheld click trackers. Then we can get the total number of attendees, maybe attendees in each gallery. To answer what art did the visitors like. You look at what art was purchased. You have sales receipts you can check. You can ask the docents to pay attention, and they'll tell you that sculpture in Gallery 3 was so popular, everyone loved it, get that artist back in. To answer what food was a hit or not. Look at the trays at the end of the night. What's gone? What's still there? What did people eat? To answer who came so I can follow up with them later. Have a guest book, an email sign up, count the emails on the list, reach out to them later. Have a feedback form asking what they'd like to see in your gallery or if they want to tell you a bit about themselves. And also while you're there, you can walk around, talk to people, ask them how they heard of you and everything. So at the end of the night, you give them a nice handout of other upcoming events and you smile and you say, thanks so much for coming. And then you send them on their way and you don't follow them home. So let's translate that kind of thinking to what we can get our data from. The first place to look for answers is cookie-free analytics tools. They do exist. So these are analytics trackers that still gather useful information, but they don't place those cookies on your website visitors' browsers, and they get their data in other ways. So in our analogy, instead of the creepy guy with a clipboard, this is the click tracker. Here are a few of the cookie-free analytics tools that we've used or heard good things about. These are all in the resources as well. And they gather useful information, but less invasively. So that first column of plausible and simple analytics are just little bits of code you can put on any site, whichever CMS you are using, so WordPress, but also anything else. These two do have a relatively small cost associated with them, primarily to cover the costs of the data storage. But remember that Google Analytics is free because you are the product. They love it because they're getting all of your data. When you're paying for a tool like this, you're paying for that privacy and that functionality. And the second column there of Jetpack and Cocoa Analytics are specific to WordPress. But to show you what these cookie-free tools can look like, this screenshot happens to be from Plausible. We use that on our site. These are not our stats. But you can see that it's just gathering for you the total number of visits, the unique visitors, your site's pages displayed in order of popularity, the top referrers to your website. Additionally, further down on the report that you can see would be like country information, what kind of device that the person's using. And you can filter down into a specific page or a specific referrer. So frankly, this information is all that a lot of you all were using Google Analytics for anyway. But this is getting it in a way that's avoiding some of those issues we talked about earlier and can streamline your process because this is all it looks like. You don't have to dig through everything else to get to it. And a lot of those other tools we mentioned have a very similar kind of simple but really useful setup. So far that was looking at data from your own site, the visitors that are on your site. But we can also creatively look for data in search engine information because people are coming to your site from those search engines. So completely separate from what happens on your site, search engines themselves are tracking all of the people using their tools to see what people look for and where they ultimately click to go. So you can look at their search engine data to see what terms people are finding you with. The two biggest search engine tools are Google Search Console and Bing Webmaster Tools, but if you're going to pick one, Google. In order to see the search engine data, first you have to prove to the search engine you own your domain or your website with just a little bit of information. But once you do that, you have permission to see their data about what people are finding your site on the search engine. We recognize the irony of suggesting a Google tool when we just said don't use the Google tool, but they are completely independent of each other. And the Search Console is collecting all this data anyway. It's independent of your site, and really we're just getting permission to take a peek at it. Technically, all of their data is a subset because people use different search engines. But Google is so ubiquitous that you can really get a general trend from their data. When you're in there, you can see the exact search terms that people typed. You can see information like how many times your results were, your results, meaning your pages, were shown in the results and how many times people clicked. And you can also see at a glance what the most popular pages on your site are for people coming from Google. So what do you do with this information? You pay attention to it. You learn a lot. So an example with the Sisters of Providence, since we looked at their brunch page earlier, they were advertising things about visiting their grounds with those kind of proper names at the bottom of the slide there. So brunch at O'Shaughnessy Dining Hall, and visit Providence Spirituality and Conference Center, or even just their whole name is Sisters of Providence of St. Mary of the Woods. But we learned that nobody was really searching for them on these words. They were searching for much simpler things, like at the top, brunch at St. Mary's, which is like a local shorthand for their space. Visit Sisters of Providence, Indiana, St. Mary of the Woods Sisters Tour. So what do you do with this? You might change some of your publications or the way you talk about yourself. You might reword some of your flyers. You might make sure these other searched for phrases are also on your website. I know you can't get away with not using your official name of your congregation, but if people are calling you other things as well, even though that might break your style guide or something, use those terms. And also, if pages are often arrived at from Google, you know to treat that as a potential stranger touch point. You can't assume that the people who end up there know anything about you or your context. You can treat that interaction as a brand new person to you.
And then there's a third place we're suggesting that you look for data, which is forms. So the form counts and the form submissions themselves. We really like forms because they allow us to standardize data collection. But whenever there's a form that you're collecting data from, you can learn from it. First, you can look at the easiest number. How many people filled out the form? This could be, just a note, this could be a form on your website, but it also could be a physical form on a clipboard at an event as well. All of these are forms. You can also learn a lot from skimming the content of your contact form submissions. For example, here is the Adores of the Blood of Christ site, and they have a form here for vocations contact, and it has some basic fields on it. And so, like we said, they can look at the number of submissions that they get through this form, but they can also look at the content of the messages. Once you filter out those weird form submissions, you might know what we mean. You're left with the real data, and you can notice trends and common questions and concerns that you get. And then just to point out, on this particular form, they did list a phone number. So if you have something like that, we recommend that you speak with the person who is being called and ask them to maybe make a phone log or a list of how many calls they get, which will give you information as well and have a record of those contact interactions. A fourth place to look for answers to those questions that you came up with is your donation information. Now, the web communications team might not know this information without talking to a development team or a finance team, but if you have an awareness of donation, like total amounts that we raised this month, or how many people have donated online, or how big were the average donations, you can really learn a lot, and this is good data to have on your radar. Knowing if people are donating online helps you know if what you're doing to promote online giving is working or not. And for something like Giving Tuesday, the donation data itself will help you gauge truer success of your fundraising campaign better than just simply page data. So the question we really want to answer is, did people donate money? Obviously, but not always as obvious when we're analyzing it. So in the worst case scenario with the old analytics model way of thinking about things, you might look at your Google Analytics for a particular year's Giving Tuesday campaign and say, wow, our Giving Tuesday landing page got 2,000 hits. What a success. Amazing. Or you might even compare relatively, like we said, with your own self and say, wow, we were up 20% traffic over last year's Giving Tuesday. But the next step that's also important, even more important, is the metric of, did we receive donations? So we have seen this sort of mismatch happen when folks do a post-campaign assessment and they look at some numbers, but not all. Some numbers do feel like they matter, like page counts and unique visitors, but you do have to be careful about giving them alone too much weight. So here is a donation form example that we have on the Loretto community website. And this generates tons of donation information that they can really learn a lot from. So you can see here from this form submission data that they could get information like, what total revenue did we raise? What percentage of the gifts that we got are recurring? What's a popular designation there for the donation? What's the average size of a single donation? And did we get a lot or a little in memorial gifts that came in? So in this case, we'll point out that they also have an additional way there that a donor could contact the development director. So that little send a message button there takes the site visitor to a contact form. So that form information and then the message combined with the actual donation information can really help give us a big picture understanding of that as well.
So our next creative data source is website comments, if you have this possible on your website. These would be the online comments that site visitors choose to leave below certain types of content on your site. By paying attention to your website comments, you can learn how many you get and also what they say. So this information can sometimes function like a suggestion box. You can see at a glance which posts generated a lot of dialogue. And you can also, on sites that have a culture of comments, your readers will tell you what they loved. And people who take the time to comment nice things are so valuable because they have willingly given you public social proof in a way that's visible to your other site visitors too. So on this example from the Adorer site, you can see that this site visitor, Susan, read the green burial story from the Adorers. She related to it because of where she is in her personal journey. And she wanted to engage with the sisters in this public, positive way. Comments are this really human thing. We do recommend skimming your comments regularly if you have them on your site. It's just nice to see the positive comments sometimes. Some of our sister clients with obituaries get amazing personal reflections in the comments of those posts. And it's also a good habit to dialogue back when appropriate to really foster those human connections. That means so much to someone who took the effort to comment in the first place. Some caveats about comments. Remember, no comments doesn't mean no readers, so don't get discouraged about that. And don't get disheartened if you get no comments or like crabby weird comments from people who don't like your official statement on something or whatever that. So don't give undue weight to the ones that aren't as positive.
Our sixth creative data source idea for you is event information. So an example question that we might want to answer about an event is, did people come to our event? So we could look to get answers to that. We could look at our registration numbers, but then we could also make sure we ask the members of our staff to take account of the people who come and report on that to us. So to do this, you don't want to forget to gather that day of data as well. You can do it casually, just through conversations with folks at the event, but we also recommend that you have some standard methods. So for example, if you are having workshops or seminars, you can have an evaluation form that you use to collect after the fact to get that immediate feedback while it's still fresh in your attendees' minds. You could also offer an email sign up while you're there if that makes sense to get feedback from the attendees. And if you get really good feedback or information in those casual conversations that day, take it from us and write it down somewhere because you will forget it when you're not on the high of running the event anymore. So idea number 7 to find data in other ways is talk to the humans. We just covered talking to people at an event. What did you learn about at this event? How did you hear about us? Where are you from? That sort of thing. But do not forget about your own staff. You can go chat with the Welcome Center front desk person your hospitality director, your facilities crew, or your residential aides, and you can see what they get asked all the time or get lots of calls about, or what they wish was on the website. We have seen, for example, their front desk folks who have asked our web team to make sure that the visiting hours are up to date because they get tons of calls about that, or that there's clear info about who's welcome for Mass, or what times Mass is, or whatever. And with one congregation, we saw an example where that the delivery trucks were never able to find the dock that they were supposed to deliver to. And all these different front desks kept getting calls. Phone operators were having to figure out the dock directions and give that to the drivers on the phone. So once we knew that, we could add a little section to the directions page that was specifically for drivers and got them to the dock that they needed to go to, and help these delivery trucks out. But it also helped our internal staff out because then they didn't get quite as many calls to field. And we would have never known that this was a need if we didn't ask the staff and get that feedback from them.
So to sum it up, you can do this. It doesn't have to feel scary. That cycle of useful analytics is in your reach. It's all about just taking those small steps and starting where you can and really fostering that culture of open-minded thinking. Remember, you are creative communicators. Trust your ideas and do what you do best. You have the jobs you do because you're creative, you're good at it, and you can figure out, you are absolutely capable of gathering a good amount of useful, actionable data without a degree in statistics or computer science. Numbers and hardcore data has its place. We love data. We are dorky like that. But just asking questions, finding all sorts of ways to answer them can get you a lot of actionable insights. And building on those insights, again, you can help be sure that your congregation is using your resources wisely because you know what's working or not. You have good ideas in your quest to support your organization's mission. People have been communicating and marketing for hundreds of years before the internet, definitely before web trackers. Yes, the current digital era is different, but it's also not different. And you're used to doing hard things. Oops. This is a quote from Keir Humphreys. He's a marketer, and he's talking here specifically about this new world we're moving into, where these third-party trackers, super invasive data gathering methods aren't viable anymore. So you might not get these super specific demographic bits and information about your site visitors or have all these really fancy retargeting capabilities. But frankly, this current reckoning and rethinking is a needed correction to something that swung too far in a certain direction. So to answer this question of how we reach our audiences without these problematic methods, he says, I don't want to be facetious, but it's the same that we used to do before. It's about knowing your audience, knowing their habits and needs, and finding a way to center their consciousness.
Okay, to sum up, so this is a really exciting time, even if it's challenging. And a big part of this is for you all to be educating your teammates and collaborators and bosses and leadership and higher ups, because it does require fresh thinking all the way up and all the way around. So these other folks may be very used to certain tools, that they've been gathering things in certain ways, so we can expect them to continue to expect certain types of reports that they're used to seeing in the past. So our tips for these kind of conversations would be to educate them on these things today about the privacy and ecological impact of doing things the old way, and to remind them that you, as a communicator and a congregation, have to spend a lot of time and energy to do it the old way. And those privacy and ecological impacts are real, and the old models have a real cost. So you can remind them that even though it's tempting, what we all really want is true success, where we're living our mission and making an impact. So once again, we have a lot of resources. You can look at them later. We just encourage you to stay open-minded, to start where you can, and move forward with grace and soul. Thank you for listening, maybe twice.
Thank you. I don't know what's next, so.